What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Let's take a look at all of the best decks to play on day one of this wild new metagame. One of the most controversial nerfs was given out to Agent Venom. Many people were angry that he was nerfed when he was no longer on sale, despite the fact that Surtur was nerfed while being on sale. I'm here to assuage those people's hurt feelings and tell them that Agent Venom, at least in my experience, is still a core part of the bounce deck, and the bounce deck, both versions, are still very, very strong right now. I wouldn't even be surprised if he still ended up being a part of the Sarah deck as well, although I haven't gotten around to fully testing it now that he's no longer making Mysterio's all upside, but instead giving an equivalent buff to Bast. As far as Agent Venom in bounce, move bounce I think is my front runner right now. I had a lot of success with this list. It was very, very powerful for me, and as you can see, basically nothing's changed. As always, if you are missing a card like Toxin, you can replace it with a card like Doctor Strange. That is perfectly acceptable here. We recently covered this list in a video, and frankly, I feel like this open early metagame, and by that I mean specifically there are a lot of people playing bad decks right now, is ripe to get run over by a well-polished machine like this deck. When everyone is out here, Thanos, I believe, in top 10% of Infinite has about a 30% play rate. It is the right time to just start dropping bombs on them while they're trying to figure out what their deck should even look like. That was a lot of my success on day one, and I had a very successful day one because I was doing things like this. If you're looking purely to climb, this is a good time to take advantage of people playing things that are far from being optimized. People are trying Thanos, people are trying Arishem. I ran into someone playing Thanos Arishem. A lot of what was a very hyper-tuned metagame with everyone playing a lot of really strong stuff consistently has shattered upon this patch because people want to go experiment with other stuff. And I think if you want to be climbing, the best thing to do is punish those people for even trying, and move bounce is excellent at doing that. I mentioned Thanos, so we're going to get to him, but to be clear, I think this deck is not as good as people may expect it to be. My experience playing both with and against Thanos was that it was, I don't know, fine, but probably worse than just not playing Thanos. When you look at how this deck is built, I mean, you can see from the title, it's literally the Scar deck, but it's in the Thanos shell, which means that our nut draw is the draw the Scar deck gets, and what's actually happening in this deck is we're playing cards that make us less consistent. And the worrying thing for me is I kind of think this is still the best Thanos deck. And if the best Thanos deck is a bad Scar Surtur deck, well, that's kind of a problem, isn't it? Thanos has some unique upsides and unique downsides. There are some cool things that this deck can do, but it is very much kind of giving up consistency in order to have, I think you could say more fun. Like, I think you could argue this deck is more fun. I think I had more fun playing it than normal Surtur Scar. But it is still a deck that fundamentally has the same nut draw as a deck that has less cards in it, which means if you're not really nutting off with like early Mind Stones, you're not going to have the consistency that a deck like that will. Now, the one thing this deck really does have over the base Surtur Scar deck is it has access to a lot of one-drops that make your Cull Obsidian sort of like a trivial issue. And I think that is actually kind of nice. I did enjoy that. I'm not sure how far off this deck is, but there are a couple things that really stick out about things that make me sad about this. The first is this deck gets housed by anyone playing any Afflict stuff. Even if you had the room to put a Luke Cage in here, which I'm not sure you do because you're currently using that spot on Mobius, but let's say you replace the Copycat. Even if you had that room, you would be a little less likely to draw it when you needed it, and you get ruined by Ajax and Hazmat because you're playing so many small one-drops. They're turning your 4/10s into 4/9s. They're no longer discounting Scar. You're getting US Agented a bunch. You're playing Mockingbird. Like, that gets US Agented really hard. This is a deck that has a notably worse matchup against Afflict stuff. And we'll get to Afflict stuff later, but I do think that in line with so many people playing stuff like this, Afflict, which was mostly being gated by the existence of a bunch of people playing Luke Cage, is now actually fairly well positioned because, again, 30% of the metagame is playing this instead of, like, with all due respect, good decks. To nobody's surprise, this deck is still good, but again, adapting it to a metagame that is as wide as this one, or at least as varied as this one, is actually a little bit difficult. Picking the right tech cards here, and by that I mean the cards you're playing in the Cosmo, Luke Cage, Shadow King, and of course, Juggernaut spots, that's a little bit difficult. The rest of this, you kind of know what's happening here. Do you want an extra 1-drop so your Cull Obsidian gets a little better? You can try Nico Minoru, right? Do you want a different kind of tech card to protect you instead of be offensive? You can play Armor instead of Shadow King. Do you want to give up your invulnerability to various Afflict decks? Well, you can cut Luke Cage and try something else there. I think this is about where I would be. My major flex spots here are Juggernaut and Shadow King, who I am less sure about right now. Juggernaut in part because 30% of the meta is playing Thanos, and there's still a pretty decent amount of bounce decks, which means you're running into decks that are filling up the board more than you used to. And so Juggernaut ends up being not necessarily the most incredible thing. Maybe a Mobius for the Mirror could do well here. I've also been skipping a lot of turn 2s in this deck, and that's just kind of how it is. Maybe a card that I can actually play on turn 2 would be helpful. I'm not exactly sure what's necessarily supposed to go in those spots, but what I am confident in is I'm extremely confident in the Luke Cage right now. Luke Cage is an excellent, excellent card because I strongly suspect that once people realize that all the Thanos decks get rolled by Afflict decks, you're going to start seeing a lot of Afflict decks, and you're going to want to be prepared for that. And Luke Cage, as weird as it may sound, is literally the only card in the game that matters in that matchup. And I feel like that does represent a bit of a design issue, but as is, you just get to play the one card that wins that matchup basically for free, so you should probably go ahead and do that. Longtime viewers of this channel, or even short-time viewers of this channel, will be familiar with Good Machine, the Husky Puppies deck. I know he's been playing it, I know it's been pretty solid, and I think that this deck is now in a slightly better position than it was, if only because it can sort of try to eat these Thanos gamers alive in some ways, and it does actually have the ability to compete with them. And I do think that, again, right now, in a sort of open-ish meta where a lot of people are playing a deck that I think is frankly kind of mediocre, that can be very beneficial to a deck like this where people already know how to play it. It's a little bit odd, a little bit oddball, a little bit weird, but I do think that this deck can, drop Infinauts on people, and that's going to beat a lot more people than it was beating only a day ago when everyone was playing Surtur Scar and Bounce, both of which are decks that can really compete with an Infinaut. Now that less people are doing that, you might actually just be winning games with 20 power, and that makes this deck make a lot more sense to me in the current context. I do think that this is likely to be a bit of a flash in the pan. It's a good enough deck, but I do think that if you're looking for the best decks in the metagame, which is, of course, the title of this video, you're gonna want to go a little deeper and play something that is a little bit more consistent at getting to its point ceiling. In the course of filming, I was informed that Husky is now on Shang over Lady Deathstrike in order to deal with this Surtur meta that we are currently in, and so I fully endorse that change. He is the guy who made the deck, after all. Okay, so fundamentally, the premise of this deck is that if 30% of the metagame is going to play Thanos, that is 30% of the metagame that is not playing Luke Cage, and you can just absolutely farm them. This is a deck that is predicated on beating the living crap out of anything that doesn't play Luke Cage. Luke Cage is the biggest gate on anyone who's playing this deck. And if you're not playing Luke, honest to God, if I'm playing against anyone, I'm pretty sure I'm favored if they don't play Luke Cage. And then, of course, the flip side there is if they do play Luke Cage, I'm pretty sure I just instantly lose. And that dynamic sucks. It's not a fun, incredible thing to happen, but if you're like the kind of person that enjoys asking questions of your opponents, making them have the answer, I think this is the ultimate in make them have it in the current edition of Marvel Snap. Do you have a Luke Cage? If you don't, you can't compete with the points here. It is extremely difficult to compete with the points here. If you're playing a Thanos deck, it is even more difficult because the friggin' board is full. It's just tough to deal with what this deck can bring to bear if you're not packing your own Luke Cage. And I personally think that we're about to be in store for a pretty big upswing in decks like this as a reaction to the Thanos decks that we've talked about previously. Okay, so let's talk about the even worse version of Thanos, and you can tell this deck is a worse version of Thanos because it's playing the card Angel, but all seriousness, the reason this deck is named the way that it is here is because of that scene from Invincible where it's, look what they need to mimic even a fraction of our power. Look at how much effort this deck is putting in to make death free, while meanwhile, every Scar Surtur deck is putting in no effort and getting a free 10. This is the difference here. Like, I don't necessarily have anything against Death Thanos, but there's a reason why it's basically never been the right move, except when we had Wave to abuse with Death. That has always, always, always been the only time that Death Thanos actually made sense as a metagame call or as a call generally. This deck is fundamentally low powered and does things that are cool and fun and unique, but generally get absolutely run over by anything more polished, because the things that are more polished are simply doing something similar to you, but at a much greater rate of actually making it happen. Yes, sometimes you get a free death, but it's probably less than the amount of times your opponents get a free Scar. It's not a good trade to be opting into right now. However, if, as I've supposed, the general reaction to Thanos is playing a lot of, Ajax hazmat type decks, it is possible that the right direction to take Thanos is to be the one that clears up the board with Killmongers and things like that, so you aren't getting hazmatted to absolute death. I'm not sure that we have hit that point yet, and I'm also not sure if when we hit that point, it will be worth all the sacrifices this deck makes in terms of card quality to get to that. It might just be better to play a different deck. Normal Bounce has the same dynamic with Move Bounce as it did previously, meaning this is the more consistent deck and Move Bounce is the one with the higher ceiling. That is generally the dynamic that will remain true throughout these decks' lifetimes. Right now, I do think there's a lot of value in being the consistent deck. That's an important thing early in metagames when other people are playing things like Thanos that aren't particularly consistent. That is a real edge. When you're playing a deck that is just good cards and your opponent is playing a deck where they're not sure what the best cards are, that is a big benefit to you. Now, you are going to want to be careful of various Killmonger things. You're still going to want to play for priority. I have run into people doing Sarah stuff. It's not totally gone, but I do feel like the meta got a little bit meaningfully better for this deck just by virtue of 30% of the people playing a deck that can't really match up to this deck in terms of points. Because this deck is so consistent at reaching that point output, it just ends up having a good matchup against Thanos basically 100% of the time. And because so many people are playing Thanos, that's a lot of really not necessarily free wins, but matchups that are slanted in your favor. I do think long-term, I prefer Move Bounce. I think if I had to pick one, I would take Move Bounce. But this is not a deck to sleep on. It is still extremely strong, and it scales very well with certain locations like Kamartaj. It has a lot of ability to be surprising thanks to Black Swan. Just a very, very powerful deck right now that does a lot of strong stuff. This is, I would say, most likely to be the baseline of the metagame. This is going to be the thing where it's like, if you have to go over the top of this, what does that look like? It looks like Move Bounce. What if you're trying to counter it? Maybe it looks like Invisible Woman Killmonger. This deck, and I think both Bounce decks really are kind of tone setters here. I personally believe that Drac Dump is one of the most underrated decks in the entire game, and that's partly because people don't really expect it to be as good as it is. It just seems like a deck that has to suck. But it's also partly because not enough people play it. This is a deck that genuinely competes with the bounce decks for having a high point ceiling. It doesn't necessarily compete with your good move bounce draws. Yeah, I mean, you're not beating like a 24 power Human Torch. Probably not happening. But it really does actually straight up compete with basically every other deck in the metagame. And it's extremely easy to play. It's extremely easy to snap and retreat with. And I really do think that there is a large contingent of people that could benefit from playing a deck like this that just simply are not. This is a strong deck that does powerful point output, that is very hard to interact with, and it has a lot of numbers in it. It just seems like a recipe for a good deck, but for some reason people haven't caught on. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a Drac Dump list, right? This is also the kind of list that you can look at our previous tier list and pick out the Splat deck there, which is doing much the same thing, but with a small move package in there. That might even be better. both of these decks are leveraging two extremely powerful cards that people don't seem to give the credit to. Those cards are Black Swan and Gwenpool. They're very, very strong right now, and the combination of them allows you to do such incredibly insane stuff on the final turn of the game that I really think more people should be playing lists like this. This is not the kind of deck that should be like a rogue off-meta deck. You should know about this, and you should probably be playing it. I got this list from Gamer Snap with a capital R, and this is a very interesting list that he was actually, or they, I suppose, was actually very angry that I got it. I got my hands on it. They were like, "Oh my god, how did you find this?" And now I'm screwed. I won't be able to farm with Negasonic anymore. And honestly, after playing this, I get it. Like, this is a deck that is aimed squarely at my aesthetics. If you can give me a mid-range deck that ends its curve at 4 and doesn't play any of that clunky garbage on the final turns of the game, you kind of sort of have my heart at that point. This deck is awesome. It's very, very fun. It's very, very unique. And the small ball approach to this list is actually really good into Thanos specifically, where you're really moving around and clogging them up. This is a metagame with a lot of people playing Thanos, where a card like Polaris, a card like Spider-Man can be a huge, 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 huge win con. And that kind of stuff is really relevant right now. And so this deck got a pretty big boost. Obviously, I think the normal Scream deck is good too, but you are probably already familiar with the normal Scream deck, I would hope, if you're watching my channel at the very least. And if you're not, I mean, check out the most recent tier list. It hasn't changed much unless you're playing this. I really enjoy small ball mid-range. It's just sort of how I'm built. I like doing things like this and being able to play multiple cards on the final turn instead of just jamming a Magneto and praying. And so I really have enjoyed the way this deck has felt to me. Of all the Agent Venom decks, this was the one that was the most hurt by the changes. I do expect it to still exist. I unfortunately don't expect many changes to be able to happen to this deck. I played against it, it felt more beatable. This is a deck that is a little bit lower on points, but still has some real power in it. But it is the deck of the Agent Venom decks that is probably the most on the edge right now. I'm very confident that Bounce Move and Bounce Normally are going to be fine. I am much less confident that this deck makes it through as is. Now, granted, Agent Venom being a 2/5, that rules. But this deck really, really, really cares about the total amount of points it can output. And there are games where it's like, okay, I mean, I have this Iron Man Mystique, but I don't have any points on the board for it to go with now. That's rough. You are a little bit more dependent on actually hitting the Agent Venom now. You're a little bit more fair, and this deck has gone from a deck that was hitting the point ceiling of the metagame to a deck that probably is not anymore, which means it requires a lot more doing, a lot more massaging in order to get into the good matchups. I still think this deck is better than playing like most Thanos decks right now, at least until we figure out what a good Thanos deck looks like, but it is, in my opinion, on notice. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. I hope you enjoy this metagame. I will tell you, I'm a little bit afraid personally that here's my worry for what's going to happen. I'll tell you what my worry is, right? My worry for what's going to happen is people aren't going to find a Thanos deck that sticks. And then people are going to start playing a lot less Thanos. And then we're going to end up back in sort of the old meta where it's like bounce, move, bounce, anti-venom, Luke Cage, afflict decks, and Surtur. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I enjoyed playing today more than I've enjoyed playing in like a month. So I will say that I'm already sort of catastrophizing. I'm like coming up with a way for things to start sucking again. I've enjoyed it right now, but I really do think we need to make sure that there's actually a Thanos deck that sticks, because I know this sounds weird. I think it's actually really important to the metagame that there's a good Thanos deck right now, or we are just going to backslide right back into what everything was previously. As always, I've been Cam Best. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and let's see each other next time.